Okay, so again, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Radha Marcum, for those of you who haven't met me. I'm a poet, and I am the author of a book called Bloodline. Oops, sorry, my slides went too fast there. And the reason that I started Poet to Poet, the newsletter on Substack, is because I get so many questions, more than any other type of question, from folks in my classes who want to know what can they do to put together a standout manuscript. And really, how can we complete the circle of writing all these individual works, really polishing them, and then bringing them together in a larger work that speaks to what's meaningful to us as writers, as poets. Bloodline was published in 2017. It won the New Mexico Book Award in 2018. But I've also been teaching for colleges and universities and privately since about 1999. So I've been in this for a little while. I've seen a lot, and I've seen some developments and trends happen across the publishing industry. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I teach for Lighthouse Writers Workshop in Denver. Many of you know me from that context. And I'm just excited to share with you all these insights that I've gathered from, peer poets and mentors, and really, again, looking at what's worked and what's working in that publishing space. So I wanted to take a really brief moment to just congratulate Catherine Indermeyer. She's a student who took one of my manuscript classes a while back, and she just won a big prize. So definitely give her book a look. She wrote to me and said, I took the class and it was really hard to figure out these sequences, but she did it, and it made this award and publishing possible for her. So, as an instructor, it couldn't give me more joy to share moments like this. So I hope that each of you will send me your good news when you get it. All right, so let's get started. So just a little housekeeping before we dive into sort of the structure of the presentation this morning. Please hold your questions. I know that you guys all have sent me some questions. I'm going to try to answer those. As more questions come up, please write them down on a piece of paper or have them handy. And I'll leave about 15 to 20 minutes after the presentation for us to have some dialogue. So just know that I'm solo teaching this. I don't have an assistant looking at the chat. So if something goes into the chat, I might miss it. So anyway, we'll have a Q&A period at the end of the presentation. So I'm guessing you're here because you're a poet who's working on a manuscript, and you really want to know, how can you transform this stack of poems, these beautiful works that you've put your heart and soul into creating and polishing, into a book. How do we go from that pile of poems to something that feels like a complete whole? It is a whole process. Right? It isn't just something that comes naturally, and yet there's so few guidelines out there as to how to go about this process. So this is what we'll be talking about today. So here's the outline of what we're going to talk about. So, and you could call it the 7 areas for success. And those areas are theme, structure, openers and closers, cohesiveness, variation, title, and formatting. So my guess is that you've probably encountered some of this advice somewhere along the way. But what I found is that it's important to think about these things in an order, right? So that we're focused on the right approach at the right time. Where we get all gummed up is when we start thinking about, for example, cohesiveness before we really thought about a theme, or we're just really focused on the formatting and we've forgotten to think about, maybe our openers and closers. Okay, so So just a little bit before we get to sort of the structured areas of success. Why is manuscript development so dang challenging? Um, it's really hard. It's difficult to see the poem as a whole when we've been working so hard on the poems as individual poems. Secondly, we're not often encouraged to envision the book. I mean, we may be part of programs that encourage that, and that's a unique situation. But in general, most MFA programs are really focused on, on craft. And a lot of the classes out there are just kind of focused on, well, how do I write a great poem? So that step of each book is sometimes a challenge for folks. We don't really know what editors want. We don't know how they think because we don't have a lot of exposure to that. There aren't a lot of, maybe aside from AWP, there aren't a lot of places we can go to hear what's on the minds of editors. And so it can feel really, it's like there's a wall there. It's opaque. We're just kind of guessing. Sometimes it's hard for us to think of ourselves as the champion of our own work. That sort of that ick feeling we get around sales and marketing. I think that's very, very common for those of us who are in the creative arts of any kind. But I think particularly for poets, there's this sense that, well, the poem should speak for itself. I shouldn't have to think of myself as a champion for my work, but we do need to embrace a little bit of that in order to get the book out there into publishers' hands, accepted by a publisher, and then to promote it after it's accepted. So what is this situation? These challenges tend to, again, just have us focused on the wrong things at the wrong time. So we put too much emphasis on perfecting the poems, typically. And I am not saying that we shouldn't, absolutely polish the poems to their most polished state in the manuscript. But I think there's a stage of developing a manuscript where you might be seeing a group of poems that are emerging and saying, okay, well, these themes are calling to me. If I want to create a manuscript, I could keep writing along these themes while I'm revising the poem. So it's sort of a parallel process that can come in. We get really stuck when it comes to structuring the book. There's all kinds of advice about, oh, just lay it all out on the floor and, make these little piles, or have a clothesline and pin everything up and see how things connect. And that can be really helpful. That could be a good, sort of tactile way to get into that task of structuring a book. But we don't usually have a good sense of what makes a structure work, and the types of structures that are available to us as poets. So there's no one formula, right? There's no one type of structure, but we do have to have a sense of how we can marry up what we've done in the poems with a structure that works for that particular manuscript. So in a nutshell, we put the details before the big picture. So the 7 areas for success really help us focus on the big picture. Anyway, it's really exhausting when we don't have these, we don't have the lenses with which to see clearly the work that we're trying to do. So anyway, we can get stuck. Pardon me, the slides were not cooperating there. So we really can get stuck, right? We can start to feel a lot like this poor puppy who's just like, I am tired and I'm bored and I don't even know if I want to do this anymore. I give up. This manuscript is trash. I'm putting it in a file. It's going away. Next. And we start, we do things like we take more classes. We think, oh, well, we just need to get better at writing poems, when really that's not the case. All right, so let's talk about the 7 areas of manuscript success. So theme. This is a really controversial topic, and I have had all sorts of very accomplished poets push back on this idea that a manuscript needs theme. What I think is happening there is that we, over time, in publishing and in the culture at large, have begun to expect theme more often from a book of poetry. It used to be that a collection was just a nice collection of really good poems. These days, theme is pretty much, it's more or less expected. And certain presses are more focused on sort of a depth of theme, and other presses are just sort of interested in seeing that the poet has thought about how these poems relate to one another. So, so I do think that the publishing space has changed around that, and our expectation as readers have changed around theme. So what do we mean by theme? I mean, first of all, you don't have to have started with a theme in mind when you're developing the poems for a book, right? So theme is something you discover over time as you write. It's a very large umbrella, and often I think about it as a part of the human experience that you're exploring currently. So themes also, they often rise right out of the territory of our lives, right? So loss and grief, a big theme right now. A lot of books that are coming out, written during the pandemic or prior, are covering that kind of territory. Love is another big one. Maybe those are the two biggest themes in poetry, love and loss. And there's all kinds of ways that those can be more nuanced. You could also, if the idea of having a theme starts to make you think of writing an essay, the way we were taught in grade school, you might think about it just as the book's territory, right? So what territory are you exploring in these poems? What's the connection between each of these individual works? Themes are not topics, right? So topics are subject matters. So if you're writing a lot of poems on the theme of loss, for example, a subject matter might be, a specific person that you're writing an elegy for. The whole book's not going to be consistent about that one person, right? It's not going to be topic driven in that way. Another poem might, deal with the loss of species, right? So there's a lot of variety that can come into the space of a book's territory, but still be thematic. And we're going to talk more about that theme and variation piece in a moment. So where are publishers looking for theme? They're really looking at it through the whole manuscript, right? They want to see that the poet is, taking them on a journey through a particular territory, or digging really deep into a certain aspect of, again, the human experience. Places they might be looking and hearing that theme, especially in the title, the TOC, in the section, the way poems are sectioned. If they're sectioned, maybe the sections have titles, and then in the words in titles themselves. So in the poem titles, are there some consistent things that are related? Maybe not the exact same words or phrases, but really looking through the TOC. And I encourage you to go do this with a book that you love. Look at the TOC and see if you can, without even diving into the content, sense the theme of the book through those titles. Okay, structure. So again, structure is something that a book certainly needs, and there are as many ways to structure a book as there are poets. So there's no right way to necessarily go about structuring a book. However, it has to have some kind of clarity about it. It has to have, if not pure logic, then some kind of intuitive logic that's driving that structural choice. And those of you who have taken mapping territory, the class that I teach on how to order a manuscript, will be familiar with this advice. You know, there are certain structures that we fall into sort of automatically by default. So those include, you know, a narrative structure, a chronological structure. We tend to group poems of a type together by form. You know, there are certain ways that the mind will naturally sort of order things based on our training. And those are often counterproductive to the way that we need to structure a poetry manuscript. So this is very complicated territory, and we can't talk about all the structural choices that we have as poets, but just to underscore that it is really important to discover the ideal structure for the contents of your book. Openers and closers. So just as in writing a poem, the first line and the last line get undue pressure. The openers and closers of the whole book, as well as any of the sections, if we decide to section the book, those have extra emphasis in terms of the importance of creating that whole. So we want to be really sensitive to how the poem introduces the reader to the book's theme. It also, you know, a good opener also really has a strong example of the poet's voice. You know, the voice is really coming through often in those openers. Sometimes they're more the first person poems versus other types of point of view. And I think sometimes we're tempted to put more abstract poems up front because they're really broad. So again, we've been taught, you know, in say essay writing to start with a really broad idea and then to boil it, you know, narrow it down into specific examples. In this case, again, we have to work against some of that default training to really pick a good opener that has voice, that has the presence of the poet really strong in it. Sometimes openers ask questions, literally, you know, they invite the reader into some kind of inquiry that's going to play out across the territory of the book. Closers, on the other hand, can be a bit quieter. Sometimes they're like the last lines of poems. They tend to make a satisfying end, but they don't shut the door entirely, right? So just as in our poems, we're not trying to, you know, put a big gong at the end. We want to make a closer that still makes space for the reader to take the experience of the book and live with it off of the page. Okay, cohesion. So this is another area, just like theme, where we tend to get a little bit gummed up in our approach or our thinking. So, you know, theme is one part of the cohesiveness of a book, but publishers are also looking for other types of regularity in a manuscript. So, you know, what they're looking for books that aren't all over the map stylistically, right? So just as they're not all over the map in terms of the themes, they're not all over the map stylistically, although there can be quite a bit of variation, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So they want to see that the voice is consistent enough, not monotonous, right? But that the writer has a strong sense of their own voice, has really developed their skills as a poet, and is using their strengths to bring out the uniqueness of their voice. Sometimes poets are really consistent in form, and their choices in form. So, you know, maybe the book is all poems that are in couplets. That can work. That could be an option. Of course, Diane Seuss wrote a beautiful book of sonnets, as did Terrence Hayes, you know, but that kind of consistency isn't as, that's not as common, the formal consistency. Other ways that you might show consistency in the manuscript: stylistic choices that are repeated. So maybe you're using epigraphs. Maybe you're really good at titling. You have a lot of really pithy short titles or long titles. Maybe you have sequenced poems or a section of poems that literally talks to one another in a very specific way. But again, I just want to encourage you to think of cohesion as very much related to this idea of voice. So the publisher wants to hear your voice and how it comes across to the reader from poem to poem. Okay, so now that I've just talked about theme and cohesion, this is a very important point. And the more I have dialogue with different publishers, the more I hear this over and over again. And readers, contest manuscript readers will say this to me. They're tired of seeing manuscripts that are, frankly, kind of boring. So they're seeing a lot of manuscripts that don't have enough variation. The poet might have poems that are all roughly the same length. So, and again, form, like you can choose a really regular use of form, but then the variation has to come in the content of what you're putting into that form. Certainly we should have variations in topic, right? So I mentioned that example of an elegy to a specific person versus the theme of grief. And definitely in tone. So this actually came up in one of our conversations with the poet to poet community the other day. Somebody was asking a great question, XP, who's a wonderful poet. She asked a great question, which is, I have all these poems, that are humorous, and I have these poems that are more serious. Do I need to just separate them and say, okay, these live in different universes and they don't belong in a manuscript together? Or, is there a way to weave them together? I don't know the answer for XP, but I do know that a variation in tone is really important to a complete manuscript. And this is something, again, that publishers are expressing over and over again. Yeah, we want to see. We don't want to see the writer just keep doing cartwheels. We want to see that they can wow us in other ways. Okay, so the book's overall title. Title's really challenging. I wrote a little post on that the other day after we had a good conversation about it, again, in the poet to poet community. It is something that often comes very late in the process. So just know that if you've been circling around a bunch of different titles and changed titles, that's very normal, very, very normal for the process. I think with Bloodline, with my book, that title it didn't even occur to me until I was well into the process of editing the book with the publisher. So that manuscript had an entirely different title when it was accepted. So it can go as far as, very late in the process. But titles are really important, right? Because they give us a sense of direction. So if you have a good working title that's working for you, fantastic. Absolutely do not overthink the title in the early stages of your process. So good titles they're really signs, they're not summation. So again, we need to go against our training in, academic writing. They don't summarize everything in the book. They're sort of a sign, at the trailhead pointing us towards the journey. A good title will open a door. It'll suggest often multiple meanings. A lot of titles have ambiguity and mystery built into them, but not too much, not where it's so abstract that the reader feels like, well, this could go anywhere. And it might be abstracted from more literal subjects in the manuscript, but sometimes it's actually a literal thing. It might be an object, for example, that's representative of the whole. So some examples, and these are all in that that post up on Substack called Some Thoughts on Titles. So a few examples that are titles that come from a phenomena or a force. Sightlines by Arthur Z. Anchor by Rebecca Aronson. Twice Alive, Forrest Gander. Radial Symmetry, Catherine Larson. So you can see already there's this tendency towards very short titles right now. I think short titles are kind of in, but there are also some beautiful longer titles as well. Some titles borrowed from culture or other disciplines, Still Life with Two Dead Peacocks and a Girl by Diane Seuss, or The Gospel According to Wild Indigo, Cyrus Cassells. Some titles are instructive. Heart First Into This Ruin, Wanda Coleman. God, I love that title. The Trees Witness Everything, Victoria Chang. Other titles might situate us in a place or time. That's often very helpful for folks. So we have titles like In the Lateness of the World, Carolyn Forche. Interglacial, James Richardson, or Moving to Climate Change Hours by Ross Below. So lots of approaches to title, but again, still doing that work of orienting the reader in the territory of the book. So you can begin to see how title comes from, is informed by that top level thematic sense of the book's territory. Okay, so last, but certainly not least, and this is something that, again, publishers, readers, folks are really just underscoring that we need to have read all of the guidelines to the last letter and make sure that all of the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. And guidelines from press to press can be really different, right? So you're going to need to look at the number of pages that they're requesting. For a full-length collection, that's between 48 and 80 typically. For chapbooks, it's a little bit smaller than that. But you don't want to go over or be under, because your manuscript's going to get tossed on the pile as soon as it hits their inbox or lands in their mailbox. The TOC format, so that is something else that the publisher often sort of dictates how they would like the TOC to appear. Acknowledgement pages, so if you have poems that are published in, previously published in journals, some publishers want to see that, and other publishers are adamant that can't be included. So really, make sure that you're not making the mistake of including it if it's something that's a no-no for that press. Some presses want biographical information. Often that comes separately. You want to really pay a lot of attention to how you write your bio so that it matches up with the book's themes. Sometimes there's a summary statement. So that's like a 1-sentence or 2-sentence blurb about what the book's about, the theme or the contents. Really, really challenging to write. And if it's too challenging to write, maybe we haven't found our theme yet, but that's a whole other discussion. So all of these really need to be impeccable. And it is a lot of work, a lot of work to be going through and following all the guidelines for all the submissions. So if you have a big, long list of publishers, just know that you're going to need to set aside a pretty dedicated amount of time to following all the guidelines really closely. Okay, so I think some of you know that I just want to pause here really quick, and you guys can think about the questions that you have. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and we're going to get to those in a minute. But I wanted to put this in front of you because I'm really, really excited about this new course that we're going to do through Poet to Poet. So it's an extended version of a class I've been teaching called Mapping Territory. And it's a really great combo for those of us who are super busy, because it's a combination of recorded instruction that you get, on week 1, and then week 2, we meet as a cohort and we go through the material. So it's really designed to help you go through the process in an ordered and structured way, with that peer feedback and with the space. I mean, so instead of trying to digest it all in one sitting and figure it all out and, kind of, it's going to, give you that time to really go through this process in a thoughtful way and come out with a finished manuscript. There are only 10 spots available. I'm keeping it small very deliberately, because I find that the small groups are much more cohesive and will give each other better feedback. The class, it's not for everyone. So if you're in a period of exploration where you're really discovering your voice and discovering what's next, I don't recommend it. But in the situation of having a really solid stack of poems, like 30 to 60, and you're really excited about exploring how they can come together, you might want to consider signing up. Chapbooks follow the same principles, just even more tightly. So if you're working on a chapbook, this course could also be very helpful, but I'm designing it for a full-length collection because I know many folks are working at that level. So let's move into your questions, and I hope I've answered some of them that came to me via email beforehand. But if you want to either put a question in the chat, or I'm happy to open it up to, if you want to just unmute.
Radha, it's Catherine. Can I ask
Yes.
an audio question? Hi. Sorry, I got here late. I am fighting the end of COVID. I'm sorry to share.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Glad you're here.
Anyway, I'm wondering about, let's see, what was my question? It was about structure. And if you can just riff a little bit on that. I got in a little late, but I caught the part where you said how we can sometimes misplace our energy and start like hyper focusing on each poem's, perfection. And I very much relate to that. And I find that I can get caught in that in structure also, where I can get caught in having an idea, but for variation, for some kind of variable structure, but then maybe being like a little bit afraid to take the leap and just commit to it, and getting kind of caught like, 1 foot on each side of the abyss or something of, do I stay with the safe, kind of sectioning, or do I make the leap, and just go for the creative impulse? Anyway, is there really a question? No, it's a topic, I guess, but maybe you could sort of respond to what I'm talking about.
But I love the way that you're describing it, because I think that's where we feel, like you said, kind of stuck with straddling the divide between, like safe structure, whatever that means to us, whether that means like a narrative structure or, something that's a little bit more logical versus something that's a bit more creative or intuitive. So one thing that's been really helpful to me and helpful to folks who've taken the Mapping Territory course is this idea that Stanley Kunitz wrote about, and I think it's in his book, The Wild Braid, which is a lovely, sort of end of the poet's life, reflecting back on the craft and a life of poetry. So I highly recommend that book to anyone who hasn't already read it. But he says something like, there are 3 basic structures, right, that we're working with in poems. And I've extended this out into to apply to a book of poetry because, well, one more thing, and then I'll get to the 3 types. It's also often said that so if you have 25 poems in a book, the book is the 26th poem, right? So we know how to do intuitive structuring if we're writing poems, right? So anyway, so that's one point. So to structure a poem, Kunitz says, there are three basic types. One is point A to point B, right? This is your typical narrative poem, right? Or your typical narratively built book. Ada Lamone's new book, The Hurting Kind, for example, goes through the seasons. And so that's roughly an A to B structure. Another example would be Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic, in which it's written in the style of a play, and I mean, it's not exactly A to B, but that there is a sense of strong progression, right? So that's one type. The second type is the structure that goes from A in a circle back to A, right? So there's a journey that has happened, but you're coming back changed into that same space. And by the way, these aren't mutually exclusive, right? So you could have something that's narrative and circular in that way. But anyway, so the Odyssey, right? That's our classic example of A to A. But that sense of journeying through a territory and coming back changed. And then the third type is the braid. And I think that oftentimes in contemporary work, we're looking at braids. So that's where there are, three or more elements that are braided together such that they make more meaning. If they were separated out into strands, for example, right? Like if we said, okay, all poems of one kind are going to be over here, another kind in the middle, and then, we kept them very separate, which is it's tempting, right? It's tempting because that's an easy way to group things. But rather, when they come together and they overlap and they touch, that's where the poems spark against one another or with one another. So I think braiding is kind of a nice strategy for us to think about. But again, braiding and circular, that could happen. Braiding and A to B, could happen. But there are sort of these basic structures when you start to look at books. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, it's definitely helpful. Thank you.
Hi, Radha. It's nice to see your face.
Good to see you. Wait, who's talking? Sorry.
It's Mary.
Hi, Mary. Good to see you.
My question is, when you were talking about voice, having a consistent voice, so I'm writing a novel that has a poetry component, so the characters are poets. So I want to do a compilation of more poems in those characters' voices as a follow-up to the novel, and have started working on it, but they're not going to, I mean, obviously I'm writing them, so there's an element of me in all of these characters, or my voice in all of these characters. But is that going to, if they're written in the voice of the character and that character's life, is that going to be consistent enough for an editor?
So you're going to turn the poems into a book of
Yes.
a separate book.
Correct.
To submit. Okay, just wanted to clarify. So they're not just going to live in the context of the novel.
Correct. There's a few that are in the novel, but I had such a great time writing the poems that I want to expand and allow all of the characters in the book an opportunity to have a poem as well and make it a separate follow-up to the novel.
Well, what a great project. And I can't say if that's enough to make a consistent voice, but it sounds like because you're working in a sort of a set of constraints already, that there's probably a high degree of consistency there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm just checking the chat because there's some questions there. Can you discuss the merits of project book versus the more loosely based thematic book? Oh my goodness, what a thorny question. Again, I think this is why certain folks, when they hear theme, they just want to like, you know, push back on it. And I don't disagree with that instinct to kind of push back on this idea of having a project book. I will say that for me personally, you could look at Bloodline as a project book because it delved pretty deeply into a particular aspect of history and my personal connection to history. And I did a lot of research with that book. I did read a lot about the physicists who were involved in the making of the atomic bombs and where they were coming from and why they were making the decisions they made and how they interacted with the landscape. And so you could call that a project book, but it was only because I was so deeply interested in exploring the territory. So I don't generally recommend we think about going and finding a project. I think the project will occur to you in the thematic direction that you're already going, if it's appropriate, right? I mean, some writers just they are interested in finding a project and executing it. I think that's, again, that comes from our training more in, say, like the nonfiction side of things. And I have quite a few friends who are nonfiction writers, and that's how they approach their books. So it's not good or bad. I would say, though, that the best poetry is going to come from where you are already and the things that naturally come to the surface in your work. Okay. Deborah's asking, what are the meeting times for your course? So the meeting times are going to be Saturday mornings from, I believe, 9 to 11. And that's only every other week. So on the week that we initiate a new topic, you'll be getting a lot of like instruction and things to digest on your own. And then every other week we meet on Saturdays. Guidelines for how many poems can be previously published and how many should be new poems. Oh, wow. So, some presses really want to see a good number of poems published previously in literary journals. It shows some commitment that you've made to publishing and to getting your work out there. And, it's a nice kind of stamp of approval on the work that you've done so far. It's not always necessary. So it really varies from publisher to publisher, how many they're looking for. I've heard the advice, oh, we want like 50% of poems to have been published. That seems like quite a lot. Others, don't really have that requirement. So, but there's no cap on like how long ago a poem was published and whether whether that's appropriate to go into a manuscript. If it fits within the manuscript, it fits within the manuscript. So, so sort of that previous publishing is neither here nor there, really. Mountain Time, yes, 9 to 11 Mountain Time, yes. Should a chapbook be more tightly bound to a theme than a larger collection? Yes, generally they are. It's true. So more consistency, less variation, but they're still looking for variation. And again, that voice. Catherine says, I've heard 20 to 30% is a good number for full-length manuscripts. Thank goodness. that seems a bit more reachable. So thank you, Catherine. Other questions?
Radha, it's Margaret. I have a question. My poems they're not really based on my personal experience, but of course, like many poets, everything you write about is kind of based on your experience in the world. And some poems I started writing in first person, some in third person, and I've kind of gone back and forth. I want to be able to invite the reader into these poems, but not make them feel like they're so opaque to them that it's just like a personal, I-person experience. What do you think about kind of the relation between first person versus third person, how it invites the reader in and kind of what room it leaves for interpretation?
Oh, wow. What a great topic. And actually, this came up in a class recently, this question of point of view and how that changes our experience as a reader. Because certain points of view, as you're pointing out, certain points of view allow the reader to come in to the poem in a different way. However, I mean, I would say that, first person poems can be incredibly powerful and moving because they're resonating with, somebody's lived experience. Third person poems, they do tend to have a bit more distance. That's kind of the point. And so a reader can come in and bring more of their own experience into the poem, which is another way of moving the reader. So I think they both have powerful effects, and I think they can live together really nicely in a manuscript. When we look at that variation, right, the variation in tone, the variation in the way that we're drawn into each of the poems, absolutely it can be different points of view.
Thank you.
So I got a couple of questions that over email that I think are really good. So I got a question about if certain subject matters or styles are taboo. I get this question a lot. So, is my manuscript going to be rejected because I'm writing in form and form isn't popular now? Or is my manuscript going to be rejected because I'm writing about a certain topic and that topic's maybe not as much in the zeitgeist currently? I think not. Of course, there's many examples of writers who are kind of writing towards the zeitgeist, and that's fine. That's something that's often very much coming again from their personal experience, their lived experience onto the page. And so it moves us because, not because it's good, not because it's speaking to the zeitgeist, but because it's coming from a specific person in a specific voice. So no, I don't think that publishers are going to, reject a manuscript over style or subject matter. I think, again, the voice is much, much more important in the consistency of the excellence of the work, no matter the subject or style. So it can be helpful to think, how will your work sit with a variety of audiences? But to really constrain ourselves to just writing about things that we think, editors are looking for would be a mistake. Other thoughts, questions?
If you're thinking of taking the class, how should you have a draft of the collection pretty much roughed out with all the poems? What size of a project would you bring to the 3-month class?
Yeah, great question. So you don't have to have tried to structure anything or, even have done this sorting work. We're going to do that together. But if you have, a good body of work that you've, gathered up and you feel really good about, and that there's potential there, I think that's, so somewhere between 30 and 60 poems if you're working on a full length collection, a little less if you're working on a chapbook.
Great.
Radha, I'd just like to personally plug you, if that's okay.
Oh.
For those of you that
There
don't
it is.
know, for those of you that don't know Radha or haven't taken a class from her, I've had the privilege when I lived in Colorado of attending several of her poetry classes. And also I would plug her book. She's a tremendous writer in her own right, and she's a great teacher. And so if you are in that stage where you are looking to put your work into a manuscript. I can't think of a better person to assist you with that. And I just wanted to share that with the group.
I'm blushing. So as we close out here, I wonder if you might all share, what's one step you're excited to take in the next, maybe in the next couple months, something that occurred to you while we were chatting today. And
Well,
if you're
okay, sorry. For me, it's just gathering that work and not worrying too much about if it thematically all fits together, but maybe in the class, figuring out from somebody else's perspective, like yours, how it does or if it does.
Jane says, stop procrastinating. Or as I like to do, procrasti-learning. That's my drug of choice.
I'm going to look harder at the poems that don't seem to fit.
Yeah, well, and don't throw them out, just put them to the side, and again, in that braided or variable structure, they might actually come in.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping.
So yeah, great. Get the poems out of the computer. Yes, onto the floor. Yes, great.
I was looking through some poems that I discovered some that I had written in 2000, and there's such a different voice from what I have now that I wanted to know if I should, how I should, when you were talking about form or structure, should I put them in like a chronological structure, like these are the ones I did before and these are the ones I did after that period, because they have such a different striking voice than what I'm doing now?
I would say no. I would say you probably want to braid them in and have them, come as counterpoint to the current voice, So consistency of voice, it's a little bit misleading because we have different aspects that we're expressing, and often that voice does change from year to year, or decade to decade, and that's just fine. I think as human beings, though, we do have some consistent, we have the things that really move us, and so there's probably other types of consistency that your manuscript could have, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Great. So you guys are all ambitious, and I love all the to-dos, the next steps. Look for what my voice is and look at other poets' books for some of those topics. Great. I'm excited to use the idea of parallel process, shaping and generating to finish my manuscript. Thank you for this perspective. Wonderful. Is there a reference you might suggest that teaches more about the three structures? Catherine, I'm going to look, or Karen, sorry, I'm going to look for where that came from, and I'll try to put that in the follow-up. I'll email you all what I can find on that. Great, big picture look at themes, fantastic. Could I talk more about parallel process? I would love to talk more about parallel process. I don't think we have time, but it's such a good area to explore, because I think we are really, involved in many processes at once when we're writing a book. Play with structure and edit simultaneously. Great. Play and edit. Yes. Fantastic. Wonderful. All right. Well, you all know where to find me if you have any follow-up questions. If you want to get together and chat about whether the class is something you would benefit from, I'm happy to jump on a quick call. But generally, I just want to say thank you so much for being here, for sharing your great questions, for being part of this community. And I hope to see you all next week. And if not next week, sometime soon in the future.
Thank you, Radha. It's really good seeing you again.
Great to see you too, Mary.